Hey everybody, Pastor Andy here, Antioch Church of the Brethren. I'm recording from home today, bringing another daily devotional. Pastor Bilbo is probably outside messing with the environment on this lovely Earth Day. Courtney and I are enjoying the outside from the inside today. Yesterday we were out in the garden talking about the beginning of John's resurrection stories. As Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden just after the empty tomb. Today we're going to continue with John's Gospel in the second to last chapter as it continues the story of Jesus' resurrection appearances and several notable things I wanted to point out in this passage. So listen to it first, beginning with verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And I want to stop there. A lot of times this is a passage that used to talk about Thomas. Is where he got his sad surname, Doubting Thomas, and sometimes we hear people called Doubting Thomases even today. And there's been a kind of a movement in some churches, I would say the last, quarter of a century or so, probably longer, of trying to redeem the image of Thomas, not as a doubter, but really as truly a faithful disciple, whom Jesus allowed to have the same experiences as the other disciples. There are several things I want to point out. One is, Thomas wasn't there, so there's a plain reading of Jesus' comment, you believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, right? He's kind of saying, Thomas, you're lucky. You're getting to see this, right? But there's going to be a lot of people, there's going to be 2,000 plus years of people who are not going to get to see what you have seen. They're not going to get to see Jesus in the body. And yet, they are also called to believe. And that's really referring to us, right? That's not referring to people in that room with them. They're referring to we today who believe based on other factors. There is no primary scientific empirical evidence for us to rely on to say this is hard fact. We rely on our experience. We rely on our logic as well, but at some point there is a leap of faith that is necessary to be a part of this faith community. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a faith community. The other thing that sticks out to me is that just because Thomas wasn't with the other 12, Jesus doesn't abandon him. He actually comes back just for Thomas. He was that important to Jesus that he came back for a personal message. He could have said, "Well, I got 10 of the disciples." So Pastor Bilbo has stuff to say about this. He feels particularly passionate about Thomas. Jesus came for the one who wasn't there. It kind of reminds me of the parable of the lost sheep, right? The shepherd's got a whole bunch of sheep. One wanders away. Jesus says the shepherd leaves the flock to go for the one. That's how important each one of us is to God. That God will go any distance to bring us back or to give us what we need. So in this case, Jesus comes back just for Thomas. And he gives him the evidence, the proof that Thomas needs to believe. I also wonder if it would have to take more for the disciples to believe the resurrection than it is for us, right? For them, they actually remembered what Jesus' body was like. They knew that he had died, right? There was hard evidence of that. For us, it's all a little bit misty. History and legend have kind of coalesced around the story, and maybe that makes it easier. I don't know. We all have to figure that out. But I also wonder about the things that are necessary for us to believe. Thomas, when the other 12 tell Thomas, "We've seen the Lord," Thomas says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand into his side, I won't believe." I think we all have a list of things that are necessary. We will believe if we see this. And it might be different for each one of us. I'll believe if I see evidence that humans are capable of compassion, right? I'll believe if God can lift me out of this pit of a life that I find myself in. I will believe if someone can make a convincing argument for this or that, right? Who knows? But what would it take? Do we have to see a miracle? Do we have to have some sort of a spiritual encounter with God? Does it have to be all explained for? What would it take? What would it take for us to believe? I think it's interesting that for Thomas, it wasn't enough that the other disciples said they saw it. It wasn't enough that all his friends believed in something so completely, so fully, that they were declaring this truth all over. It didn't matter that there were 10 witnesses. He needed to see with his own eyes, not the face of Jesus, but the wounds of Jesus. Thomas needed to see the holes, the scars, maybe even the blood. He needed to see the evidence that Jesus was not just a ghost, but that he had truly died and experienced all of this pain and suffering on behalf of them, that he had overcome all of this. For Thomas, it was all necessary, all part of the story. Maybe in some strange way, Thomas understood that you can't have resurrection without suffering. So the question we can be left with is, what do we require in order to believe? We all require something. Maybe it's different for each one of us. So maybe consider for yourselves, what would it take for you to believe today? What are you hoping that God reveals? And we'll be back tomorrow. Everyone have a good night.